fellow learners, and welcome to the 19th lecture in this NPTEL course on 20th century poetry. So far, we have covered the work of a few iconic American and British poets, and most recently, we have concluded a discussion and a close reading of the work American poet Robert Frost. We will now shift our attention to the work of another poet who is also a contemporary of Robert Frost, but whose work is dramatically different from that of Robert Frost. The poet we will turn our attention to now is Edna St. Vincent Millay. Years are 1892 to 1950, and Millay was and remains an extremely well-known, an extremely popular, an extremely loved poet. Also happens to be an American poet. For many people, Edna St. Vincent Millay's writing defines what is most powerful, most iconic, and most comforting about poetry itself. So it's not just that Millay is an iconic 20th century American poet, but also embodies some of the most powerful aspects of what poetry is, how poetry works, and the power that it has, and why people continue to return to reading poetry in the first place. We will try and understand exactly what makes Millay's writing so popular in this and the next few lectures. I will begin with a brief overview of some biographical details before turning to a close reading of the first poem that Edna St. Vincent Millay published in her lifetime. I mentioned that Millay was a contemporary of Robert Frost. It is also pertinent to note that Millay, in some ways, is more popular than Frost, in the sense that readers derive more joy from reading Millay than they might do in reading Frost. Now, this statement admittedly has a personal bent to it, and my own experiences, my own perspectives tone this statement. It may be different for other readers and other scholars, but one thing cannot be denied is that the number of readers that Frost has is significantly greater than those that Millay has, and that is because Frost was canonized. Frost was made part of the national American education and cultural program. Poems by Robert Frost are prescribed for study in countless programs. Poems with titles such as Miles to Go Before I Sleep, A Fork in the Country Road. These lines have become part of the English language, which is testament to the fact that so many people consider Frost as part of the very existence of English literature. The same cannot be said for Edna St. Vincent Millay, and yet readers swear by Millay's work. Once a reader has encountered the power and the intensity of Millay's writing, it's difficult to return to a state of not knowing it. Once one reads Millay, one finds it difficult to go back. We will experience some of that power in the subsequent lectures, but I just want to begin by saying that Millay's writing exerts a different kind of intensity and an almost hypnotic charm. Millay also offers us a chance to view 20th century poetry from a very different perspective. Millay's writing is not difficult. Unlike the work of other poets such as T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound, Millay does not write in a way that is difficult to understand. This is also borne out in the analogy I have just drawn between Millay's work and that of Robert Frost. Like Frost, Millay is also accessible in a very obvious way. Now, speaking about the difficulty that modernism is associated with, Millay was self-consciously dismissive of the learned difficulty of modernism. Learned difficulty is something that a lot of poets cultivated. A lot of poets tried consciously to make their poems difficult to understand, less accessible to the common public. T.S. Eliot was very famously dismissive of the accessibility of much contemporary poetry. Millay did not share such kind of a dismissal. In fact, Millay found it difficult to understand why a poet would make an effort to make their poems less accessible. In this impulse, Millay aligns with Robert Frost, and both share what may be called a quintessentially American habit of using language clearly, of communicating to readers complex ideas and feelings, but doing that through the use of conventional grammar and standard English usage. Of course, this is not to say that their poetic styles were boring. They, of course, experimented with poetic genres and styles, but conventional diction, uh, writing verse that could be identified as an established genre, such as a sonnet, that conventionality took priority over any esoteric or intellectual or cerebral quality of newness. In this sense, Millay and Frost stand on one side, and across the room stand poets like Pound and Eliot. As the novelist and scholar Laurie Moore describes this analogy, Pound is known to have famously said, "Make it new," in his call to poets who call themselves imagists. Make it new, meaning write poetry in a way that it is easily identifiable as something totally new, something that's totally different from poetry that has been written in the past. This was Pound. Millay, in response, or can be thought of as responding to Pound's call, it never got old in the first place. So why should we make it new? Millay's writing is full of a sense that the old poetic forms, the conventional poetic forms, still have a great deal of power. They allow poets the opportunity to express powerful emotions. They allow readers to experience powerful emotions, powerful language. So why should something that is still good, why should it be renovated or rejuvenated? There was no need in Millay's poetic view to renew conventional forms, and we will see a powerful use of these old poetic forms. Some biographical details now will be useful. Millay was born and spent most of her early life in the town of Camden, in the northeastern American state of Maine. Camden, incidentally, was home to another very, very iconic American poet, but that was a different Camden, and that poet was Walt Whitman, who was from Camden, New Jersey. Throughout her life, Millay had been and had gotten used to being treated as a celebrity. To some extent, it may be said that her behavior in the latter half of her life might have been trained or determined by her treatment and her perception as an actual celebrity in the early part of her life. She was a precocious, brilliant, and talented student who went on to become a successful, glamorous, fashionable, and at some point even scandalous writer. She was also an outspoken feminist and did not shy away from writing about personal or what was then seen as personal things, such as relationships, including sexual relationships, in her poems. In her lifetime, Millay earned the approval of many senior and older poets of her time, including Thomas Hardy, Edmund Wilson, and Eleanor Wiley. As we will find out, Thomas Hardy's presence looms like a shadow over all of 20th century poetry. And we have also seen earlier in this course how Thomas Hardy's poems for Emma Gifford exert that power through their particular use of language and through their powerful articulation of the experience of grief. Millay's earliest publications date from the years 1906. From the years 1906 to the year 1910, Millay's poems appeared in the children's magazine St. Nicholas. And in the year 1907, one of her prize-winning poems appeared in the magazine Current Opinion. Millay credits much of her intellectual and creative development to her mother Cora, who had divorced her husband early in their marriage, took up a job as a nurse, and raised 3 daughters by herself. One instance of how Cora's foresight was crucial to the development of her daughter Edna's development as a poet happened in the year 1912, when Cora Millay noticed an advertisement for a poetry competition in the magazine The Lyric Year. Edna submitted a few poems, including Renaissance. The editor, Ferdinand Earle, wrote to Edna praising the poems and expressing confidence that Edna would win the prize. As it happened, Edna did not win the prize, but Renaissance was published and it received high praise in response when it appeared in print in the year 1912. Edna was encouraged by her high school English teacher to aim high when it came to applying to college, and Millay applied accordingly to Vassar College in upstate New York. And after 4 years of studying at Vassar, moved to New York City in the year 1917. Here, the publisher Kennelly helped bring out the first collection of Millay's verse in book form, which is titled Renaissance and Other Poems. It was here that Edna St. Vincent Millay met Floyd Dell, a socialist and playwright, who cast her in the play The Angel Intrudes, and the two of them began a brief relationship. This was to be the first of many relationships that Millay would conduct in public, because she would go on to write about them, and which would also continue to inspire her poems. The next year, Millay met Arthur Davison Ficke, a U.S. Army major who was on his way to Paris to deliver war-related messages. This was the time of the First World War. They had a brief affair about which both would continue to write sonnets for the rest of their careers. Millay's were published in the second volume of her verse, which is 2nd April, the volume that appeared in 1921. At one point, Millay took on the pseudonym of Nancy Boyd, and under the pseudonym published many stories about many risque matters in the magazine Vanity Fair. She also earned the respect of editors at this magazine, which also became, without any such written contract, the unofficial or unauthorized publisher of her poems. As we will learn later, the context of Vanity Fair, the reputation that this magazine had, as well as the kind of expectations that readers came to have from the writing which was published in this magazine, was central to an understanding of how Edna St. Vincent Millay's poetic career developed. These expectations had to do with stereotypical roles that were expected from people who inhabited male and female bodies. Nancy Boyd was the pseudonym that Millay took on, and Millay published many pieces about women's matters. Millay wrote about things such as choosing the right kind of clothes, whether or not to use makeup, how to conduct one's relationships, what parts of the city to travel to, where to eat, where to dine, etc. So a lot of issues which were traditionally seen as the preserve of women only. These were things that Millay addressed under the pseudonym of Nancy Boyd. The Vanity Fair magazine also published most of Millay's most iconic and widely circulated poems. So it's worth remembering that while we read some of these very, very famous sonnets, At some point, one of the magazine's editors, Edmund Wilson, offered to pay for Millay to stay in Europe, to live in Europe, to travel at the expense of the magazine, in addition to receiving a salary, as long as she continued to write for them. As a consequence, in January 1921, Millay left New York City for Paris. The 1920s were Millay's most productive years. I say that because this was the decade which cemented her place in the firmament of American literature as a powerful, serious, and compelling poet. Today, Millay is most remembered for poems that were composed and published in this decade. 1920 saw the publication of A Few Figs from Thistles, and for many readers, this publication, 1920s book, A Few Figs from Thistles, marks the first departure in Millay's writing. If you recall, the only publication that Millay had had before this was Renaissance and Other Poems. Renaissance was perceived as a very serious, spiritual, and intellectual volume concerned with matters of very high philosophical and intellectual seriousness. By contrast, Figs was received and perceived as a frivolous volume, at least in contrast to Renaissance. In itself, it may have moments of intellectual and philosophical weight, but compared to Renaissance, it was found to be quite frivolous. This change may or may not be substantial, but it exists at the level of tone. What we find at the level of tone is that the tone of the second volume is less reverential, more ready to contradict itself. It easily reverses its own positions and is not afraid of appearing flippant or cynical. This volume also shocked many readers because of how outspoken it was and how frank it was. One reason for this appearance of frankness and the perception of shock was that at the time, women and women writers were still expected to adhere to Victorian-era norms of morality. This also meant that women writers were not expected to write about their relationships, and especially if the relationship entailed personal, romantic, or sexual matters. Harriet Monroe, the editor and founder of the Chicago-based poetry magazine, declared Millay the most powerful female poet since Sappho. All of this goes to establish how the association of Edna St. Vincent Millay as a good poet, as among the most powerful, successful, and best poets writing in America in the 20th century, is very strongly associated with a certain idea of femininity. There was an expectation that women poets, female poets, would appear or behave in a certain way. And Edna St. Vincent Millay did something to those expectations. Sometimes she challenged them, sometimes she confirmed them, but she did not let them be as they were. So how Edna St. Vincent Millay engages with the perception of feminine poetry, female poetry, and what is expected from a woman poet, that needs to be understood if we are to arrive at an authoritative understanding of the quality and the writing of this very powerful poet. To continue with the biographical overview, 1921 saw the publication of Second April. This contains both free verse, that is unrhymed verse, as well as sonnets for fic, as mentioned earlier. A couple of years later, in 1923, Edna St. Vincent Millay published The Harp Weaver and Other Poems. This book can be said to have made Millay a household name. She won the Pulitzer Prize for this book and was the first woman writer to have won the prize at the time that she won it. We will now begin to trace the poetic development of this writer by paying very close attention to the very first poem that this writer published. Now, of course, as I have detailed in this overview, technically speaking, the very first poem that Edna St. Vincent Millay published was written in her childhood, but we are treating Renaissance as the first poem because this was the first poem that won a major poetry award and is also the first poem in the first book that Millay published. So this is Renaissance. I will read through the poem first and stop occasionally to offer commentary. Renaissance by Edna St. Vincent Millay. All I could see from where I stood was 3 long mountains and a wood. I turned and looked another way and saw 3 islands in a bay. So with my eyes I traced the line of the horizon, thin and fine, straight around till I was come back to where I'd started from, and all I saw from where I stood was 3 long mountains and a wood. So the first stanza very clearly establishes that there is a limit to how much the poet can perceive. 3 long mountains and a wood, 3 long mountains and a wood. The poet traces the boundaries of her vision. The poet turns her gaze a full circle, comes back to what she had began by surveying. The circular nature of this survey conveys that there is a limit to how much one can perceive. As a mortal, as a human being, there are limitations to our sensory, perceptive organs. Further, the poet writes, "Over these things I could not see. These were the things that bounded me, and I could touch them with my hand, almost, I thought, from where I stand. And all at once things seemed so small. My breath came short and scarce at all. But sure the sky is big, I said, miles and miles above my head. So here upon my back I lie, and look my fill into the sky." And so I looked, and after all, the sky was not so very tall. The sky, I said, must somewhere stop, and sure enough, I see the top. The sky, I thought, is not so grand. I most could touch it with my hand. And reaching up to my hand to try, I screamed to feel it touch the sky. So something dramatic changes by the time we have reached the end of the second stanza. From feeling limited, from noting the boundaries of her perception in the first stanza, the poet has found a way to perceive her surroundings, that is, moving her hand, right? Through a trick of her brain, the poet feels that somehow there is no limit to her perception. The poet extends her hand, reaches it towards the sky. Right? The poet feels that maybe I can touch the sky with my hand. The poet lying down extends her hand, moves it towards the sky, and screams because she feels that her hand is actually touching the sky. Now, speaking in a very matter-of-fact, scientific, quantifiable way, speaking with an awareness of the laws of physics, for instance, we can say that this is simply a childish imagination. This is an instance of a child playing tricks with her surroundings. And yet, there is something that persuades us to think otherwise, because the poet here has let out an involuntary scream, and the scream is reflected in the change of tone of these words. There is an urgency to the words. The word scream is used a few times, and the word scream is repeated in the first line of the third stanza, which I will now read. "I screamed, and lo, infinity came down and settled over me, forced back my scream into my chest, bent back my arm upon my breast, and pressing off the undefined, the definition on my mind, held up before my eyes a glass through which my shrinking sight did pass, until it seemed I must behold immensity made manifold, whispered to me a word whose sound deafened the air for worlds around, and brought unmuffled to my ears the gossiping of friendly spheres, the creaking of the tented sky, the ticking of eternity. So something has happened. The scream that the poet has let out is not unwarranted. An unknown, strange character has entered the poet's perception, and in fact has entered the poem as an actor. Who is this actor? This actor is named Infinity with the capital I. Infinity is personified. Infinity is doing things. What is Infinity doing? It is forcing the poet's scream back into her chest, is bending her arm back upon her breast. It is whispering to the poet words whose sounds deafen the air. It has brought loud, unmuffled sounds to the poet's ears, the gossiping of friendly spheres, right? The poet is hearing things. Suddenly the senses, which were so bounded, so limited to mortal concerns in the first stanza, are now unbounded. The poet can hear planets revolving. The poet has broken Newton's laws of motion. To use the physics metaphor, the poet has left a realistic, earthly order of time and space, and the poet has entered, one can say, Einsteinian quantum space and time. The poet can hear the creaking of the tented sky, the gossiping of friendly spheres. How does the poet react to this unbounded, expansive, capacious ability to perceive? Let us read. I saw and heard and knew at last the how and why of all things past and present and forevermore. The universe cleft to the core lay open to my probing sense, that sickening I would fain pluck thence, but could not, nay, but needs must suck at the great wound, and could not pluck my lips away till I had drawn all venom out. Ah, fearful pawn, for my omniscience paid I a toll in infinite remorse of soul. Now, a very strange thing has happened. The poet experiences great power. The poet learns things that the poet did not expect to learn. The how and why of all things past, present, future, and forevermore. The universe cleft to the core. So the poet suddenly has the opportunity to probe, to investigate, to ask difficult, impossible questions. Why does the world work the way it does? The poet has this opportunity. And yet, the poet feels bound or somehow unable or somehow restricted. Why? Because the poet feels a compulsion to suck at the great wound and the inability to pluck her lips away until she had drawn all venom out. So, instead of noticing the universe as an intellectual puzzle, which she has now received the power to unpack, she perceives the universe as a great wound that needs to be treated somehow, and feels compelled to draw the venom out of that wound into herself. A very strange image. And this causes the poet great distress. She writes, "Ah, fearful pawn." She calls herself a fearful pawn. She is not really in power. She seems to have received power, but the consequence of receiving that power is that she is at the mercy of other powers. For my omniscience paid I toll in infinite remorse of soul. She is all-powerful like God, but she responds to that power with remorse, with guilt. She is not able to wield that power without remorse. She feels guilt. And so she is extremely distressed. And I will read just a few more lines before winding up. All sin was of my sinning, all atoning mine. mine the gall of all regret. Mine was the weight of every brooded wrong, the hate that stood behind every envious thrust, mine every greed, mine every lust. So we can see that the poet, having received God-like omniscience, God-like cognitive capacity, the ability to understand everything that happens, the poet has become like God. The consequence of that is that the poet thinks that because she has such power, she has only guilt. The power to see everything fills her with the guilt that she is unable to stop any wrong thing. An extremely contradictory thought, an extremely strange moment, and yet this is how the poet responds to the gift of great power. I will stop here and continue with the reading of this poem, which I will wind up and move on to one more long poem, the second in this volume, Renaissance. We will do that in the next lecture. Thank you.